Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to call to order the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting for Wednesday, 5, pursuant to ARS 38-431.02. Notice is hereby given to the members of the commission and to the general public that at this meeting, the commission may vote to go into executive session, which will not be open to the public. We would go into an executive session for legal advice and discussion with the commission's attorney for issues for items listed on the agenda pursuant to ARS 38-431.03A3. If we can do roll call.
Carol Mandino,
Present.
Joshua Maher, Christine Sheehy, she is excused. Sorry. CJ Lukey,
Present.
Mary Norton,
Here.
Ian Sharp is absent. Megan Weller. Here. Thank you.
Public comment. At this time, any member of the public may address the commission on any subject within our jurisdiction that is not scheduled before the commission today. Due to open meeting laws, the commission cannot discuss or act on items presented during this portion of the agenda. To address the commission on an item that is listed on the agenda, please wait for me to call for public comment at the time that the item is heard. We're going to go, sorry. I need to ask if there's any public comment. Nothing online? Hearing and seeing none, I will go to the approval of the minutes from the regular meeting that we held on Wednesday, January 8th, 2025.
I move to approve the minutes from January 8th with the correction in the spelling of Alex's name down toward the bottom.
I'm sorry, with what
Correct.
correction?
There was just a spelling correction of Alex's name at the bottom agenda item.
So you're,
Oh, no, wait a minute. Maybe it's been, down under miscellaneous items. That was the only thing. There was 2 places where her name was misspelled.
so you're moving to approve the minutes as corrected with, I have under miscellaneous, I think it's already been, is it the last name? Never mind. No, are you sure?
I was looking at what was available on the website, so maybe something else has been corrected.
So it looks like it was already corrected. Is that correct? Thinking it's the last name. Maybe not. She's saying under miscellaneous.
Is your first name spelled correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's all A's.
Yeah.
Yeah, and over here it's Alondra. on the one online.
Okay. I'm not sure why we have
2 versions.
I'll second. Okay, so hold on a second. So the minutes, the paper copy I have is correct, but the online version is incorrect. Did you just click on that at the start of the meeting? So do we need to have that corrected on the online version?
I will get that corrected.
Okay, so then the minutes have to be approved as corrected, and then we had a second by CJ as corrected. Is that correct? Okay. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The motion carries. Thank you. Now we will move on to general business, and item 5A is the land availability suitability study and code analysis project on the code concepts report.
Thank you, Chair. Well, next time we start a project, we will try to do a more minimized title. Good afternoon. I'm Michelle McNulty, the Planning Director for the City of Flagstaff. With me is Tiffany Andel, Zoning Code Manager, Genevieve Parathry, Climate Analysis, Resiliency Analysis. Okay, with Sustainability, and Jen Michelson, one of our housing managers. So this is an update on the last CAP project. If you will recall, we were here in April of 2024 and gave you an update on the land availability suitability site. I'm sorry, land availability and site suitability study, the last part of this, and the code diagnostic report. So for the newer commissioners, just to let you know, this is a partnership between planning, housing, and sustainability, as well as Mountain Line. And it's to look at all of our development codes through the lens of the declared housing and climate emergencies, and making sure that all of our codes that touch development are working in line with the goals of both of those plans. The land availability suitability study was really about looking at what land is left to be available to be developed, whether it be because it was determined to be kind of underutilized. And by underutilized, we're saying that the built structure on the property was 10% of the or less of the property value. It's not to be degrading to that property. It's just that typically that's where you see a likelihood of reinvestment. And so really looking at those barriers, including development codes, environmental constraints, so slopes, slopes primarily, and floodplains, and the gaps in infrastructure. And then our opportunity sites were identified that had the greatest potential for increasing housing supply while promoting compact, walkable, multimodal, and transit-oriented development, including mixed use and infill development. Opportunity sites really just meant that they were sites that had a certain level of readiness. Maybe they have the zoning in place, so they're already zoned maybe R1 or medium density residential, and they have utilities serving the site. That might be a higher on the opportunity, or it might be that they don't have their zoning, but they have the infrastructure. So that's what we meant by opportunity site. And then the code analysis project is a 3-part. It's intended to evaluate development codes and processes to identify areas of improvement towards the city's housing and climate goals, as I mentioned, separated into 3 different tasks. The diagnostic report, and that was really just the blush of going through all of the development codes and saying where are the barriers in relation to those housing and climate goals. And that report is complete. We are now here at the code concepts to address the highest priority barriers that were determined in that diagnostic report. And then we will move on to the final code recommendations. We're going to talk a lot more about what those next steps look like throughout this presentation. So just a reminder that the focus of the code diagnostic report, as I mentioned, it was all development code that touches, all code that touches development. So fire code, engineering design standards, and specifications for new infrastructure, zoning code, general plans, and the subdivision code, public rights of way and property, building code, transportation impact analysis manual. So while not a code, it is something that heavily influences the way we develop. Incentive policy for affordable housing. I do want to note that the incentive policy for sustainability is in the zoning code, and that's why it's not specifically mentioned, but it was also evaluated. And there was also an equity and displacement vulnerability assessment as part of that. So we could identify the areas that we see as being impacted with displacement by different measures. So here's a list of all kind of the key code barriers. The ones that are in the darker blue, while very significant, are not as heavily focused on as we are looking at some of the ones that are in that grayed out color, although we are looking at, actually that's not a true statement. As I said that, I realized all of this is on the table and we looked at this throughout the code concept. So sorry for that confusion, but you can see there were various different barriers that were identified which was why we did part of that, the land availability, because we needed to understand how much of our, like, what is the zoning of most of our land that's left to develop. That way it could inform code changes so that they're right size for Flagstaff. And so a lot of these barriers were identified, and now we are on the path of identifying how to overcome those barriers and what are the opportunities. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany Antal. Thanks.
I moved some of those slides around on her at the last moment because I think it's fun. Sorry about that. The Code Concepts Report, the purpose of this phase of the project is really to develop some conceptual alternatives for code updates that address some of the most significant barriers identified in the code diagnostic report. There was a very large list that came out of the code diagnostic report, and not every single one of them is going to be touched necessarily through this project. But the report is organized in two different sections. The first up is that there are scenarios for the core standards and incentives, and I will go over what those core standards are in a minute. The use regulation and housing types, the maximum density and floor area ratio, maximum parking requirements, affordable housing incentives, and sustainability incentives. So those are things that are generally found in the zoning code, and there are different scenarios that are created that have different sets of outcomes. So when we're talking about these code concepts, we know we want to touch into these core standards. And it's the code concepts report is kind of doing a push-pull. It is looking at if we change this component, we come up with this different set of outcomes, and if we change this component, we can come up with this different set of outcomes. So at the end of the day, we're looking for feedback on what outcomes are we wanting to get to, and how exactly should we be getting there, and what makes us comfortable and what makes us uncomfortable, and what uncomfortableness are we willing to accept. So a lot of this conversation is going to be about the need for some trade-offs in order to achieve certain goals. The next section of the report is the code concepts, which does focus on sustainability requirements and incentives, our resource protection overlay, reduced street widths, and winter parking ordinance. These ones were elevated as well because of their specific types of impacts to the delivering things like the core standards. And so you'll start to see as we go through this presentation how they overlap. So the Code Concepts Report methodology focused on doing best practice research. That best practice research focused on specifically on transportation demand management strategies, the resource protection overlay, our sustainability incentive requirements, and the winter parking ordinance. We didn't spend as much time on best practices for the specific code concepts, which are each of these scenarios, because we know that these are areas that we can change the mark. We can do best practices research on density and parking standards, but every community is going to sort of be different. And again, where you move the mark in terms of these core concepts will determine what those outcomes are. So the consultants took a look at 3 different scenarios in terms of these core code concepts. And the first is optimizing incentives for sustainable design and affordable housing. Currently, we have incentives built into our code. Those incentives are not as successful as they could be in terms of delivering the true outcome that we're seeking. Scenario 2 is elevating sustainable design and increasing market rate housing production. So the idea here is moving more of the sustainable design options that we currently incentivize and even a list beyond, and making those more a requirement for by right development. And caveating that with increases in density, with potential reduction of parking to increase market rate housing to sort of as an offset. Scenario 3 is about supporting sustainability through density and maximizing market rate housing production. I'm going to go more in detail into each one of these scenarios. Additionally, the idea of each of these scenarios and the different components of the code were run through prototype modeling. So the prototype modeling was intended to test both the revenue as well as the cost of what these code impacts would be and potential options to reduce costs. Even if we find something that is desirable or a code provision that wants to move in a certain direction, are there ways to offset that particular cost of that improvement? There was also a spatial analysis completed. Again, this is going towards like all of the different push-pulls and all of the different goals that we have. So a spatial analysis was completed specifically in terms of reducing vehicle miles traveled. And so it was specific to what kinds of code changes we could make and if they could be focused in such a way to achieve a higher greenhouse gas emission reduction. And then lastly, the whole idea is from all of this push-pull on all of these different code concepts, we want to transition into providing feedback to the consultant so that they can integrate all of the things that we are wanting to achieve into the final code recommendations, right? So they could go write the code recommendations for us today, but again, there's different things that we want to be able to achieve. So those core standards and incentives, again, you're going to see that use regulation and housing types by the zoning district, maximum density and floor area ratio, minimum parking requirements, affordable housing incentives, and the sustainable building incentives are the big core standards that were looked at in these prototype models. So the scenarios, again, that first one is optimizing the incentive for sustainable design and affordable housing. So it basically seeks to encourage a higher share of future development to use our existing incentive programs by making those incentive programs more enticing. That's the short story, right? So we have we have certain things that we can give you through those incentives. We have a certain density bonus. We'll go through these numbers so that you can see them all in relation to one another. But you know what the consultant came back is that there isn't enough payout. The incentive isn't high enough. Even though we do have developers taking advantage of the incentives, we could capture more potentially and get more developments falling into this incentive program if we made the incentives more desirable and more economically feasible. Scenario 2 would elevate the sustainability performance of all developments by applying new requirements for sustainable design. So a lot of the feedback that we often get, so right now we incentivize a lot of sustainable features, and there's a lot of things to get us towards that overarching goal of carbon neutrality by 2030. But right now, there's not a lot of things we require outright. So the idea of this scenario and the modeling and the structure that you'll see is making some of those features by right, but to offset any potential cost affiliated with those, we would be increasing density and reducing parking requirements as a desirability to sort of offset any potential cost increase. And it depends on what the the actual sustainability feature is, on whether or not it even has a cost. Some do not, some might have initial costs. And again, there's also that long run payoff on any sustainability incentive where, right, so there you might have an initial upfront cost that might be slightly higher, but over the length or term of that house or that dwelling unit, the maintenance and the ongoing costs may be lower. Scenario 3 looks at really just focusing on market rate housing and the production of market rate housing. So scenario 3 is mostly about increasing density and reducing or lowering parking standards. So those are the 3 scenarios. The idea with increasing market rate housing, I will say that incentives are still included in scenario 2 and 3. They would still exist. The desirability of those incentives would be more closely related to what we have now, because there would be an increase in overall ability to do density as a whole under these 2 scenarios for market rate housing. Next up, so to try to simplify the ideas expressed in these scenarios, first is increasing the overall housing production by reducing key barriers to development. So scenario 1, that's a low priority because scenario 1, again, is specifically focused on increasing the incentives. So you can see that for scenario 2, it's a medium priority. And for scenario 3, it's the highest priority, right? For elevating the sustainable design of all new projects, it's a low priority for scenario 1, it's a high priority for scenario 2, and it's a low priority for scenario 3. In terms of encouraging more private market developers to use the incentives, that's the priority in scenario 1, and it's a medium priority in scenario 2 and 3. So hopefully that helps to synthesize. I like to go back to this drawing to remind myself time and time again what each of the overall, just the outcome that we're looking for in each one of these scenarios. Now, an important thing to stress is that one scenario does not have to be the answer for everything. It could be portions of scenario 1, portions of scenario 2, portions of scenario 3. Okay. So looking at what this actually means in terms of code parameters, you'll start to see that in our existing zoning code, our density standards right now are between 6 units an acre and 29 units an acre. And this is really just from R1 zoning up. This is not talking about the estate residential or the rural residential zones. And our parking standards are anywhere from 1 to 3 parking spaces on average. And this is a gross generalization, but it gives you the sort of sense of what it is that you're looking at in terms of what we require for development. Right now, in terms of our incentives, we have a density bonus for sustainability that's 25%, for density bonus for affordable units up to 45%. And we do allow a parking reduction for affordable units. It's actually slightly higher than 1 space per unit. It's more like 1.25, but splitting hairs at this point. Scenario 1 does not change any of the by right standards and makes all of its change to the incentive. So it's basically bumping up that density bonus, bumping up and reducing the amount of parking across both incentives. Scenario 2 would increase max density from 10 to 80 units rather than the 6 to 29. It would reduce that base parking to between 1 and 1.5 spaces per unit. It looks at single-use residential buildings permitted in commercial zones. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. It'll also introduce floor area ratio. And again, we'll get to this in a little bit more detail, and then you'll start to understand the why on this. And would also apply new sustainability requirements to all projects. So they would be base level requirements. The incentives would also be elevated to a degree. Scenario 3 does the same thing as scenario 2, but does not include an FAR cap and does not include the requirement for sustainability requirements. So all three scenarios do include the following two changes. Okay, so allowing missing middle housing types, which for this intense purpose, so missing middle means a lot of different things to different folks. Sometimes missing middle can be a much higher range of units in a project. But in terms of this conversation, we are following House Bill 2721, which is the missing middle bill that was recently passed and requires mandates zoning code changes by January 1st, 2026. And so that's why it talks about as required by state law. So that focus is on that duplex, that triplex, fourplex, and townhomes. So I just don't want it to be confused because I know in some worlds missing middle can be larger than those specific building types. But the reason why we focused on that is this. So this is included in all of the scenarios because we will be headed in this direction. Also allowing single-use residential. So single-use residential is a new fun term that I love that comes out of this. So single-use is all residential as opposed to mixed use, which is residential and commercial, right? So single use residential buildings and commercial zones. And as a housing specialist in our community once told me, or recently told me, well, it only makes sense since commercial is now co-opting our residential zones. And by this, she means short-term rentals. It only makes sense that residential start to co-opt into our commercial zones. So scenario 1 takes this idea and wants to use single-use residential as an incentive. The scenarios in 2 and 3, which are looking more at just market rate production, they talk about this idea of single-use residential as by right. Right now, single-use residential in our commercial zones is permitted. It does require a conditional use permit. So let's talk about density and where density would go across the scenarios. So you can see what our existing code allows. B is by right. S is the sustainability incentive. A is the affordable housing incentive. So right now, under our existing code, if you were in the R1 zone, and again, this is a simplification of what our density standards are. It gets a little bit more complex just because we have a reduction with the resource protection overlay. But when you look at this right now in R1, it's the highest you can go is 6 units an acre. This is proposing with the sustainability incentive, you could get to 8. With the affordable housing incentive, you can get to 9. In scenario 1, which is wanting to just bump up the incentives, you can see the 6 remains the same. R1 would get to 9 units per acre for the sustainability incentive, and we're getting up to 12 units an acre for the affordable housing incentive. Scenario 2 and 3 are going to be the same because they're focusing on market rate production. So we're getting up to by right 10 units an acre. The incentives start to get us to 14 and 18 units an acre. I will not bore you and run through every single one of these zones, but the point is just to show you 2 and 3 are mostly going to be very similar. They're not completely always similar. They do change in these commercial zones, but you want to look at this. But again, the push is towards getting towards that market rate housing and increasing market rate housing in 2 and 3. So this is what the density bonuses look like. In the existing code, we're currently at 25% for the sustainability, and between 5 and 45% because it's a sliding scale based on the number of units that are affordable units that are created. And it's talking about in scenario one, really heavily increasing because it's, again, scenario one is 100% focused on getting people into those incentives. We're talking about some big jump in those numbers. Scenario 2 and 3 still bump the numbers, but they're lower than scenario 1 is. So one of the things that has come up over time and some of the concerns and the reason that our code has sort of evolved and included things like our high occupancy housing standards is because not only were we seeing a push for bigger high density projects, but in addition to high density, we're also seeing high intensity. And by intensity, we're really talking about, you know, the number of people that are living in a dwelling unit, because we were seeing projects coming in that had a higher bedroom count. You know, we were seeing complexes that included a vast majority of units that were 5-bedroom, 5-bathroom, 4-bedroom, 4-bathroom. They have a different intensity affiliated with it. And so while there's often a lot of, it's always kind of hard to express the concern for why that structure of housing was less favorable. It's more just because there is a different impact that's felt from those types of projects because they do have a different level of intensity affiliated with them. And so when you think about all of this in your head, it's important to remember that density and intensity are not always the same. For example, we've been working through a project on high occupancy housing where it's a 20 unit building. So it's 64 units an acre, but they're all 1-bedroom units. So that's 64 bedrooms an acre. And so it doesn't have the same intensity as it would if they were all 3 or 4-bedroom units, right? You'd have a lot more people in the larger bedroom units. So it's really important to remember that having a density standard doesn't always get us to what that intensity is. So floor area ratio, this is kind of self-explanatory of what floor area ratio is. It is a way of trying to understand the intensity of a use through the size of the building. Floor area ratio is lot coverage, but it includes every floor of the building, okay? So if you have a multi-story building, every floor of that building is included in that FAR. Does anybody need a further explanation on FAR before I go forward? Okay. Right now, FAR only really applies in our commercial zones. It's funny because FAR shows up in that missing middle bill. So that House Bill 2721 that I mentioned, I've been mocking it for, I don't know, the last 6 months, but probably wrongly so, because my comment has been, well, who applies FAR to residential? Because we generally don't. But what is the potential of FAR? FAR has the potential of regulating that intensity, right? So in our existing code, you will see that we only have those FAR standards in our commercial zones, community commercial, highway commercial, and commercial services. In scenario 1, that leaves that pretty much the same in those districts. In scenario 2, it's talking about adding these FARs all the way into our residential zones. So instead of looking at it in terms of lot coverage, and to be honest with you, I always thought lot coverage is about sort of an intensity of how much you can build. But I also always, in my brain, I always thought it was more of a stormwater issue and how much impervious surface we were having. It turns out I was completely wrong. They don't calculate it that way at all, but for some reason I had that in my crazy brain. The idea here, right, and some of the feedback that I've heard over time is, well, as we make these changes to code, how are we guaranteed that we're going to have smaller homes? How are we guaranteed that we're going to see the units that we need to get to achieve certain components? Well, this is one of the tools you can use. 0.5, so 0.5, I have a 9,000 square foot lot. 0.9 FAR on that 9,000 square foot lot would be 4,500 square feet. So the FAR on that particular lot would be 4,500 square feet. You can see that the smaller the lot goes, that that FAR is going to start. So you're not just looking at small houses with big lots. And again, all of these numbers can be calibrated, right? We can achieve different things with these FAR standards. But the idea behind FAR is that it is a way to sort of control that intensity of development and try to achieve certain units that we're looking for. It also deals with sort of that compatibility component. I don't always love to use that term, but in terms of, trying to make sure that density or that development is sort of staying in line with one another, FAR is a good tool to use, but it is about hitting these numbers right. So I throw this out here in terms of this is one of the elements that was modeled as part of scenario 2 in terms of trying to achieve that type of market rate housing that we're looking for. In terms of parking standards by scenario, you can see that under our existing code, we're at about 1.75. And again, these are really that sort of average number of spaces per unit. For sustainability incentives, the parking calculations do not change. They do only change for affordable housing. And then generally commercial space and mixed use buildings is 1 per 300, but for residential uses, you'd go back to that first part of the table. In terms of the scenario 1, again, we're lowering those parking requirements in order to achieve the incentives. Of course, we know that parking spaces within a building add to the overall cost of that housing. So one of the ideas here is that to move that needle in terms of housing production and housing price, especially with the higher density projects, pushing the lever on parking will help reduce cost in terms of the development of that housing. I'm going to pull Genevieve to talk about the sustainability features really quickly.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Genevieve Pear-3 in the Sustainability Division at the city. So one component of this project was to model or look at different sustainability standards that could be incorporated into scenario 2. So and into all the scenarios, but primarily in scenario 2. So this table just walks through where some of the standards that we could use are going to be present. And these are kind of high level ideas. They're not calibrated specifically to Flagstaff. So if we did move forward with these, a lot more work would need to be done to figure out what they would actually look like. So just want to preface that. But in the existing code, most of them would only be present in the sustainability incentives. And those are actually already in our code. So that's reflecting the all electric building, water resource protection, materials management plan, and EV charging spaces. So those are in our existing sustainability incentives in our current code, but they are not present in the base code or in the affordable housing incentives. And then in scenario 1, where it optimizes the incentives, basically reduces parking and increases density in exchange for using these incentives, they're also present there, but not present in the base code and affordable housing incentives. You go to scenario 2, and then they become present in most of the by right sustainable incentives and affordable housing incentives. They're at slightly different levels, but they're much more present in scenario 2. And then in scenario 3, they go back to just being in the sustainability incentives. And feel free to stop me if you have any questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick question. So when the sustainability incentive program was rewritten like about 3 years ago, have you had anybody utilize that
We
program?
have, yes. Trying to think which developments. A couple have, but not very. Again, as Tiffany mentioned, it's not utilized very often. Yeah. And another component of this project was modeling carbon emissions throughout the different scenarios. So I won't go into this in a lot of detail unless anyone has questions, but basically the consultant looked at different sources of where emissions come from, as well as sequestering emissions through like carbon sequestration and building structure and landscape planting, or emissions that you don't emit from using more energy. So basically kind of looking at what ways they emit more emissions, the way development can kind of sequester some of those emissions, and look at how that plays out through across those three scenarios. And basically, as wouldn't be surprised, scenario 2 performed the best there. So they basically looked at how many emissions would be emitted from by right development using the sustainability incentives and using affordable incentives. So by across the board, scenario 2 performed well, but it also performed, existing code performed fairly well under the sustainable incentives. And basically anytime the sustainability incentives were used, it performed better. So developments emitted fewer greenhouse gas emissions, but across the board, scenario 2 performed the best in the by right development, and as well as taking the sustainable incentives and the affordable housing incentives. Any questions before I'm going to pass it back to Tiffany? Good. Okay.
So the three overarching code scenarios were each applied to a set of development prototypes. So now that we've gone through those complexities, the results of this modeling allow us to identify how the different combinations of changes to buy right and incentive standards perform in terms of housing and sustainability outcomes. So, Genevieve just showed you as part of that modeling for carbon emissions, that scenario 2 achieved that particular goal and that particular outcome. There are 60 development prototypes in the report. I am not going through 60 development prototypes for you. We'll have a little quick synopsis here. Additionally, conducted to better understand and evaluate the potential impacts of each scenario on vehicle miles traveled. So they looked at areas in the city that already have a low VMT. And they tried to see if there was a single zoning category that could be targeted for density increases or parking reductions in order to focus that particular incentive, I guess, in areas where we knew we already had low VMT. So areas where we have low VMT are likely to already be areas that are served by transit or have great bike ped facilities or are close to places where people work and places where people shop and their general needs. There really wasn't one zone other than the central business district zone that we really found that could be targeted. And then if concentrating densities in low VMT areas is a priority, we would probably, instead of targeting as like making a change to a specific zoning code, we're likely going to have to use a different tool. So we're either going to have to create a zoning district and rezone properties to that district, create a new overlay zone, which is basically the same thing as what I just said before, and then, or coming up with proximity-based regulation. Proximity-based regulation would be you're within a quarter mile of a permanent transit line, and because of that, your density can be increased this much. Okay. So key findings and implications from the scenarios. The biggest thing that rings true is that the existing development environment in Flagstaff is extremely challenging with the high cost of construction and land. So there are a lot of things that affect the cost of housing that are 100% outside of our control, that have nothing to do with our codes and requirements. The cost of labor, the cost of materials, and the cost of land fall outside of that. With that being said, as they move through the prototypes, and if you look in depth in the prototypes, they are a snapshot in time. They aren't perfect. In some ways, it looks as if that it's not possible to even like break even on a development case or on a development project. And we absolutely know that's not the case, right? We would not be seeing development projects moving forward if there wasn't a way to break through. But it is hard to capture all of those components of what makes a development affordable in a certain instance. So it is a snapshot in time. what is important to recognize as part of those prototype models is as we pull the levers on the different code requirements, can we move the needle on the cost and the revenue side? And the answer is yes. And then the question becomes, how far do we go? So scenario one presents a viable opportunity for increasing the attractiveness of our incentive programs. It is the higher risk strategy for increasing housing production and achieving carbon neutrality. So in terms of the options that we're, or the goals and policies that we're trying to achieve, the housing plan is focused on two areas: housing affordability as well as housing production. It's a two-pronged issue. Carbon neutrality as well, it falls under our climate emergency. Scenario one, however, is the lowest risk option for Prop 207 claims, because it doesn't change the by right standards. Scenario two illustrates that there's a viable opportunity to elevate sustainability standards for all new developments, so long as the increased costs are offset by the economic benefits of increased densities and reduced parking. The only way you get out of Prop 207 when you add additional requirements into code is to offset it with something else. Even if it's not a cost offset, it's a perception of a developer has the ability, you're going to give them to get, right? And that is something that strategically we have to think about in terms of code, that if we want to achieve more from our development standards in terms of certain community goals, that we do need to offset that with other parameters that make it desirable for a developer to not pursue Prop 207. Scenario three achieves similar results as scenario two in improving housing outcomes, but did not elevate sustainability outcomes relative to scenario two. So again, when we talk about housing, it is important to recognize that we're tinkering with the incentives, which get us an affordable housing product. An affordable housing product commits those units for a certain time frame to a certain area median income. Whereas housing production, there is the assumption that with housing production, you will increase the stock and also help to offset costs by increasing stock and availability of housing. Across all scenarios, parking reductions were critical to market feasibility of higher density prototypes. So the one thing to understand is that it's, and we talked about this the other day when we were talking about resource protection, it's all of the things that we layer on top of one another, right? We're not getting in, we haven't gotten to the point of, if we increase density, we have to reduce lot sizes, we'll have to change setbacks. All of those things still have to be figured out, and those will be the next steps when we can give the consultant the direction of, yeah, we're comfortable with reducing parking in these areas, or we're comfortable increasing housing production in this way, or we're uncomfortable with pushing on our incentives. So whatever direction it is that we go towards at the end of the day, it was important to understand that parking reductions really were instrumental to that market feasibility of those higher density projects. If the city does desire to concentrate density in areas where households are likely to drive less, then we would need to use targeted rezonings. There wasn't one zoning district that was going to get us there. And if the policy goal is to broadly increase density throughout the community, then scenarios 2 and 3 are a more effective approach. I didn't pull out the exact numbers, but they give you numbers through each of the scenarios, what housing production could be. It does dramatically increase with scenario 2 and 3. the core standards and incentives decision points. So this is what we really are looking for in this conversation. And I know it's a lot to ask of you tonight. It is in the staff summary. So the idea should be percolating what sort of we're looking at, but we're wanting feedback from you on if there are certain zoning districts where you think it would make more sense to apply the different scenarios to rather than citywide. We're looking for your feedback on which scenarios you have preferential, or if there's pieces or parts of a scenario, and I can give you an example if that's helpful, of the way a scenario can be broken up. And should the density bonus for affordable housing be higher than sustainability? That's the way it currently is in the code. We've always given more for affordable housing than we have for sustainability. Should we consider along those lines, or are we evaluating those both equally? Knowing that we have emergencies for both. I know it's a lot. And then, do you support moving forward with substantial parking reductions? And I will say, we can come back to this slide and get on to the other pieces, because there are other parts of the parking conversation that I think are important to those decisions. And then, do you want to pursue code and map concept that would more narrowly focus some of these upzonings, or focusing density increases in areas that are considered low VMT, or other similar geography, such as areas close to transit? So I'm going to come back to those questions, let you sort of ruminate on it for a second. I know there's a lot of really big, heavy things in there. I just to give an example too of how the scenarios can sort of be split up. One of the first things we talked about was single-use residential in commercial zones. So all of the scenarios looked at it differently, right? So scenarios 2 and 3 focused on allowing that by right, where scenario 1 tends to make it an incentive. Well, for that particular component of the proposed code concepts, that could be an incentive, but then market rate housing could still, you could still follow the gist of scenario 2 or 3 if housing production was a priority as well. So there are pieces of it that can go towards the incentives. I know it's a lot. And it could take you in circles all day long. And this is like a very meaty report, and read it over and over again and find a different nugget in it every time. We want to follow up with these other code concepts that have some pretty meaty best practices research on them. The component of the sustainability and transportation demand management requirement, transportation demand management is kind of the sort of critical thing towards getting people to travel differently, right? So if we can create a system where people don't have the demand to drive everywhere, the idea is that people will use alternative modes, or different they will travel differently because their needs could be potentially different. Anyway, the sustainability and transportation demand management looks at sort of the idea here is creating a menu-based approach to sustainability features within a development. So this would sort of align with scenario 2. It could be like our planned residential development options, where a developer has choices. This works really well for the vast array of types of developments that there are in Flagstaff. What works best in terms of a sustainability feature for an apartment complex is going to be different than it is for a single family home. So this talks about adopting that menu points-based approach. Then the document takes a deep dive into our resource protection overlay. These code concepts they actually propose migrating from a broad overlay zone that requires site-specific inventories to a more focused overlay that focuses on resources that were inventoried as part of a citywide study. So when they did best practices, that's what a lot more of the communities did, is they applied their overlay and their standards to areas that they had already identified as significant resources. And I don't know if you've heard me say this before, but I've dealt with properties that have no resources but are limited because they're in the resource protection overlay. So something happened on the site, they were burned. But what we just broadly did when we adopted the resource protection overlay was we applied it to everything that was vacant over 5 acres at the time we adopted the code, and easy peasy lemon squeezy, we moved on. But we didn't go in and evaluate and say those are our highest, most valuable resources. So what they're seeing in best practices is that these types of requirements were applied to areas that were deemed the most environmentally sensitive. This concept could apply to both forest and slope resources. So going in and proactively identifying the slope resources that need to be preserved upfront, and then focusing on that rather than trying to do it on a site-by-site basis. Also, they suggest that resource protection standards should not restrict density for the reason that I just said. There are sites that were burned, that they don't have slope, they don't have resources to be preserved, but yet their density is lower than what other similar zone properties would be allowed to have. So there's a lot of good research there. I think there's lots of little nuggets. I loved reading about Santa Cruz, which looks at a different caliber of tree for preservation. There's a lot of things to look at in terms of resource protection, in terms of the resource protection overlay. I would also note that we do have another set of eyes on the resource protection overlay, coming from another group that is also highly focused on impacts of wildfires and vegetation management and things like that. So we are looking for a whole additional set of feedback on resource protection overlay as we go forward. In terms of code concepts as well, street widths came up time and time again. And the reason why, and when you look at this section of the code, it talks about wanting to make the streets or allow streets, especially residential streets, a little bit more narrow. When you apply everything on top of one another in the R1 zone, you can't even get to the 6 units an acre, right? If you met our street standards and our resource protection overlay, you aren't going to get there. You're going to get probably about 4.2. And then if we were talking about increasing density standards even more and we leave everything on as an overlap and we don't adjust or recalibrate other standards, it's fine. We can change the density all day long, but if it's physically not possible to achieve it, did we really succeed in doing anything? Same goes for the incentives. So whether you're thinking of this as, I only want to see this applied to the incentives, remember that the incentives very heavily rely on increasing density, whether it's for by right or for the incentive. And the last issue is that winter parking ordinance. So they looked at similar cities with similar snow. Of course, there's no place that is exactly like Flagstaff. So there's that. But, one of the things about talking about reducing parking requirements is how proactive do we want to be? In some situations, communities have relied on the market to resolve the issue. In some situations, we know that parking will transfer to the streets. We have very restrictive street parking standards. Do we want to be proactive in that approach? And here's the important thing about all of these things. As I talk about, especially other divisions and other department standards that fall out of the zoning code, these may come with costs. If we manage snow in a different way, we may need different resources. We may need different staffing in order to be able to do those things differently. So we don't want to take a one-sided or a shallow approach. But the idea is yeah, I'd be okay with reducing parking standards, but we've got to get to a place where we can allow on-street parking all year round. Do those things go hand in hand? Are they both important? And if so, are we as a community willing to expend the cost to look at doing it differently? Because each of us in the city has a different mandate. We have a different goal. Our public works division works very hard. It's never easy for them. People have high expectations. Our citizenry has high expectations on the services they deliver. I'm sure there's nobody that ever calls them up and says, "Thank you for plowing my road. You did a great job." I'm sure that's never a call that they get. Maybe once in a while. Um, their jobs are very difficult and it's very hard to please everyone. And so part of it may be as well that our community expectations have to change. If our community has come across that it is important that we prioritize affordable housing, then maybe we're willing to sacrifice somewhere else. Um, I I can't speak for where we're going to go and what those directions are going to be. We just want you to think about them all in conjunction with one another, that we're not trying to create the unintended consequences that I hate that term. I hate it. But we're trying very hard to not create unintended consequences. We're trying to take the proactive look and the approach. And that's why these code concepts got elevated. They're for discussion, they're for feedback. Are they important to moving the code parameters? How best can we move in the direction? How can we make our development codes better? So with that as well, in terms of sustainability and the transportation demand management, do you support the concept of a points-based sustainability requirement? That would push us closer to some of the parameters of scenario 2. Should there be a wider menu of TDM strategies? I'm sure wherever your feedback is going to come, wherever you're most comfortable and wherever you have, the most interest in. So if you don't have feedback on all of these components, it's fine. In terms of the resource protection overlay, in the longer term, do you support the concept that the city should replace the RPO with something that's more narrowly focused? But in the short term, maybe look for flexibility for development, like removing additional density restrictions, allowing slopes or trees on slopes to be part of the overall calculation. Should we work on those smaller features of the RPO? In terms of street widths, do you support us developing a strategy and outlining a process for creating narrow or local street designs? The big rub in terms of street widths is that, what is mandating our street widths right now is the fire code. So there would be a lot of work that needs to happen with the fire department and addressing fire codes. Like I said, there's always some friction. And then the winter parking ordinance, should we be looking at developing different strategies in terms of how we manage winter parking ordinance? Will on-street parking be a necessity if we look at parking reductions? And I just have one more slide, and I promise I'll stop talking. And it's really what our next steps are. In terms of public outreach, our first amount of public outreach was really focused. So in terms of the code diagnostic, we focused that on community stakeholders that use our code on a regular basis. It's not that everybody else's opinions weren't important, but we really wanted to gain an understanding of what developers were facing. And it's not always what a developer wants or what they think is best, but we wanted to understand what are the absolute features that are causing problems when developing, and what is it that prevents you from getting those cross lines. So code barriers was really very singularly focused. We are now at this code concepts. We're trying to understand what the comfortable, where people are comfortable in terms of going with the code. How far do we want to go before we set that consultant loose on coming up with code recommendations? We want to come back with something that is feasible, that you all are willing to adopt, that can make it through the public process, and that also achieves the very big goals that we've been given to obtain. But I think it's also really important to understand that everything comes with a trade-off and a cost to a degree. So it's important to understand that, I mean, we all hear that friction every day of we want housing units that are more affordable. We want people to be able to be in our community, but what's the trade-off that we're willing to get to in order to get those things? There will continue to be public outreach, of course, code recommendations. We wanted to sort of, when we get to that point, we want to start working with the neighborhoods that have probably experienced the most disruption based on zoning to date, and having them understand that as code changes happen throughout the city, that it's a benefit to those neighborhoods that have carried the weight for Flagstaff for a long time. And that comes out of our vulnerability and displacement assessment. We have a lot of neighborhoods in Flagstaff that carry the bulk of the allowed density in Flagstaff. Southside, Plaza Vieja, Sunnyside, they carry the vast majority of the what will be the allowed density. They are the most at risk, while the rest of the city enjoys sort of a protection in the fact that those additional densities are not permitted in their neighborhoods. They're less vulnerable. They're less vulnerable to redevelopment and gentrification. So we want to make sure that we're reaching out to those neighborhoods that are the most vulnerable as we get to those code recommendations, because we want people to understand that we're trying to achieve a balance in this community. And lastly, right now at this point, we are trying to resolve these outstanding decision points so that we can put the consultant in a good path. We, as the project management team, made some decisions on what barriers were really the biggest ones to address. And now we're looking for your feedback in terms of how do we move this forward into the code recommendations and where are we comfortable with going. And then the next step will be those formal code recommendations. Of course, we'll be back. Everybody should recognize that a report that has formal code recommendations does not mean it is a code. We still have to go through that last step, which is the preparation and adoption of code. So even though we have a code barriers report, it irritates people what's in it because it hits sensitive points. That is the point. It was meant to do that. It's meant to say, right? I mean, but it's also about where our values are. It's important to look at everything. We've had to do this with staff internally. We're not targeting you. We're not picking on you. We understand what your mandate and your mission is. If you dreamt big, could you look at doing this a different way? So some of that is just what it might mean for our community and how we manage things and stepping out of our box of what's comfortable. So there you go. I will go back to those decision points and let you have the floor and take as many notes as possible. And wherever you have the feedback, I mean, there's a lot to absorb here. There's time in the process. If you want to go and spend a weekend with that report, because I know you just definitely want to, and you want to write up a lot of feedback to us, we're open to it, and that's what we're looking for. And then, of course, we get that fun job of synthesizing all of that and working with council, coming to final resolutions. We will be doing the same presentation. We're going to get better at it every time. This is the first time. I'm going to get way better at it. But we will be at council on February 4th. I expect that they're going to look at us with a lot of, they're going to need time to think on it as well, because there's a lot of big topics in here. So with that being said, I will shut up.
Thank you all for this large information report. Kind of makes my head explode. For me, it comes around with, what is the number one goal, right? So I know for myself, it would be more affordable housing. We don't have affordable housing in this community, especially for home ownership. And that's, more or less something that's nearer and dearer to my heart would be to get more home ownership for people who can't afford to live in this community. And it used to be that they'd go out to the county areas, and the county areas aren't affordable anymore as well. So now when we talk about sustainability, they're living in Williams. They're living much further from Flagstaff and contributing more to unsustainable practices than if they were able to afford someplace in the community. And that, to me, helps with sustainability and affordability. And again, I think when I'm out in the community and I say, well, I'm planning and zoning, and they go, well, we don't want to see any more high-rise apartment buildings. I mean, that's the number one comment I get from people who live in Flagstaff. And I think it comes down to those aren't, they're not necessarily affordable. They're probably more transient, community driven. So they're not permanent residents. Some of them could be students. Some of them could just be here for for either they bought a condo because they want to come here and ski during the winter, whatever it is. There's just different reasons why they have those, use those units. And then you give the extra points of you have to work with the fire department. You have to work with whoever. My mind is so with whoever does snow removal. And it also affects. So if you make a change to the overall snow removal plan for Flagstaff, the entire community, have you talked to residents? If that, so other long-term residents who have seen, like I've been here, it'll be 50 years this year. And the changes that have happened in the snow removal, even from the time that I've owned my current home, which is about 38 years, to now is highly different. Yeah, it's highly different from when I moved there to now. I just think this is a lot to comprehend in one meeting. And I also feel like it's, you talked about going out and getting opinions from residents or just holding a few meetings, but I think this is a bigger community issue that would, to me, call for more meetings than just 2 or 3 during the process. I'm going to leave it there right now and ask for other commissioners and how they feel. And, one other thing is that we're 7 people. We do represent the community, but we're only 7 people. The city council is only 7 people, even though they do represent the community and they were elected by the community. We weren't elected by the community. So I'm going to leave it at that and ask for other comments from other commissioners at this point. Anybody have any comments? Mary?
I do. So, I actually watched the city council meeting on the 14th on that presentation and took some notes. And I attended a community meeting that was unrelated to, commissions, council, just it was community members that were a group that's beginning to talk about this. And that may come and talk to us here or council or whatever. And so it was good to sit back and listen to a large group of community members of what their concerns are as this goes. And that kind of addresses the point that the chair made about, reaching out to further the public outreach for public input and maybe even coming back to us, or yes, allowing us to email you with our comments, because it is a lot. And so I haven't seen that presentation as a document online yet. I'm assuming it will be attached somewhere along the line, probably at least by the city council thing. But what I did want to say was, I'm glad that it's outwardly stated the inherent conflicts of goals, desires, limitations, and Prop 207 risks. I think that the more outwardly we acknowledge that and deal with it, the better outcome we'll have, a better balance of putting all this together to come up with something that's actually workable and amendable to everyone, and that actually produces the results that the community is looking for, without driving away development and building here. Um, I'm glad that we're addressing, or at least mentioning, all the little parts and the ramifications that trickle down, because if we chip away at all these little pieces, make little changes, and that was part of the reason why I was even a bit uncomfortable with the resource protection um, change that we voted on at the last minute, because I felt like if we chip away here and here and here, the end result is that collectively it becomes unreasonable or unacceptable. So I'm glad that even that, though it's overwhelming, that we are looking at it holistically, because realizing that as we talk about density, it automatically means resource protection and parking and things like that that have been important topics to us all and to the community. And again, always back to where's our guarantee of the outcomes that we want? Are we going to get not only affordable housing, but attainable market rate housing? Um, you know, Still honoring our resources, and ideally getting that missing middle and smaller floor plans, um, even in single family homes. So those are the things that I look toward, like which parts of these will get us to those things. Um, Let me see here. Uh, I guess I will, as I looked at the scenarios, and I'll just kind of go through some of my notes, and I may email you with it a little bit more coherently and organized in my thoughts. I found scenario two, I'm sorry, I found scenario one. It wouldn't be my first choice. Um, and I'm always concerned about what happens in the rural residential zones with regard to the planned residential developments, and making sure, because so much of our land that we have is within RR and it can be developed by PRDs. And I'm not completely confident that we've only seen one case that came with one with the new PRD incentives, but I'm not completely confident that it's going to be enough to get us where we hoped it would get us to the type of developments that we were looking for. So that concerns me, the whole by right situation. Um, on the sustainability issues, um, having coming out of the building industry myself, and working on EPA programs and Energy Star programs, and writing materials for those programs and selling homes with those features and such. I know that I could tell during my tenure that those were not items that were important to buyers, unfortunately. Um, And there's a lot that is just done automatically in the building industry right now. And even the builders that we have that predominantly build here, where they're already building to those higher standards, whether they're Energy Star or zero energy ready, things like that. So I'm not sure that us continuing to push on sustainable uh, design and features is going to be maybe necessary or something that is going to be worth putting all our eggs in that basket. Increasing housing production, and I think, in my opinion, increasing that missing middle product and increasing the ability to build smaller homes on smaller lots, smaller square footages. That seems to be really lacking for those first time buyers. And I don't mean the affordable first time buyers. I mean the market rate first time buyers that are looking for, you know, 1,200 to 1,500 square foot homes to be starting out in. So I uh, know that between density and smaller unit sizes and smaller lots, um, it automatically affects the resource protection overlay and the street issues and the parking issues, which are somewhat hot topics for me personally. Um, as far as I'll speak to the resource protection overlay, I absolutely am in support of allowing the counting, the overlapping of slope and forest resources to be counted together. Um, I'm wondering, like, if we did something like that and we've already potentially reduced the counting of the land where there are streets to be in a development, if city council chooses to adopt that, is that enough of an adjustment in the resource protection overlay? Um, could that be left as it is? But I also see the caveat of parcels that have nothing on them and then parcels that have a lot on them. And I don't have an answer for that, but I think that's worth looking into. Um, the smaller streets, I'd be in favor of smaller streets, but not with the reduction of parking. Um, People and their families and their vehicles, they have to be able to park somewhere. So either we have enough parking on lots with garages or driveways or frontage, um, or we keep the streets the same size and allow for street parking. I'm okay with the winter parking rotation and some of those um, creative methods that maybe are used in other cities, but I know that Public Works, as you mentioned here, I know Public Works is overwhelmed and short-staffed, and I can't even imagine the idea of trying to alert everyone in the city if we have enough accumulated snowfall of whether you can park or not. I think maybe the alternating street side might be a something that would be easy to enforce, but I'm cognizant of the nightmare that that could create for Public Works and enforcement. Um, And I think what concerns me about reducing parking in garages is that when there's not parking and there's not garage parking or garage storage, uh, that's what families need. And those homes or those units that don't have that, it just encourages and invites the use of those homes as vacation rentals or short-term rentals because those uses don't need parking and don't need garage storage and things like that. So I, having raised a family and all the gear and things and cars as you raise children that end up with vehicles and outdoor gear because that's where we live here, it's got to go somewhere. And what I find is that people end up with a storage unit and that's not feasible either. Then we're building more storage units and people are paying for that. Um, I am also concerned with the traffic demand management requirements and the issues that traffic impact analysis and what triggers mitigation and final outcomes on streets. I know we've talked about issues whether streets are dictated by the city or by ADOT and how that happens and where those improvements get made. But I know that the public and even in my community, it's frustrating to not see intersection mitigations until it's absolutely necessary at the end of time when it becomes a dangerous situation. So if that gets factored in, I think that's helpful to those considerations. As far as the overlay zonings, there's the issue is what happens in downtown and in higher density areas, like in, you know, the R1 end zone and things like that, and what happens on greenfield spaces and new developments. I know you can't necessarily treat it differently, but it is so different. And I don't know what the answer is on that. Maybe the overlays are the answer about that. I'm intrigued by the uh, the FAR ratios and maybe what that might bring. I agree with you, Tiffany. I'd always like, I don't want to be bothered with figuring that out or understanding that. And now I see that maybe that can help with residential and square footages and things like that. But anyway, my concern always is even then when we have small lots and maybe small footprints is what happens is builders and product goes up and we're still ending up with, you know, 17 to 2,800 square feet or more, just upward on a house that could have been a smaller home on a small lot that might have become that attainable first time buyer home for somebody, you know, like my adult children that would like to stay here and own a home. Um, that pretty much is my highlights on my thoughts at this point. Thanks.
Other commissioners? Have any comments? CJ?
Okay. Um, so I definitely agree with Mary on the resource protection. I feel like she has a lot of knowledge, and whenever she speaks about it, I agree. Um, the other thing though that I think you brought up before, Mary, that I always sticks with me is, do we have any data that shows that when we provide incentives, it leads to more affordable housing? You know, do we have any correlation there? So that, I mean, I know from staff perspective, you've probably seen it, but is there any quantitative thing that shows those two things? My initial response to the different scenarios is I don't agree with scenario one anymore, because I know we've talked about the short-term housing, and I feel like as long as there are developers who are coming in and setting up CCRs that allow for short-term housing, then I don't see that correlation between providing incentives and them allowing that to happen, because then 20% of what they're building is going into a short-term rentals. I don't agree with that at all. I like scenario two. I thought that that showed a lot of uh, movement towards where we want to go. And when we were talking about certain places, I really see the corridor along 4th Street from Route 66 to Cedar. I'd love to see that be like what I saw in San Diego downtown, that mixed use between condos and commercial. I think that would be a good place for it. It's got a lot of, um, what do we call it? Transportation that's available already. So I think that'd be good. And then it allows for that parking problem to be addressed. Let's see. Um, I guess that's it for now. Oh, I know. The other thing that always is a hitch in my get along is the snow parking. because I live in Lower Greenlaw and I asked staff to find out what our streets are. Our streets are 26 feet of asphalt. They do have areas on either side that you're supposed to be allowed to park in, but we don't have sidewalks. So people park in their lawns, which is fine for us. We don't have any problem with having 3 or 4 cars in your front lawn in Lower Greenlaw. That's just how we go. But I think for other areas to look at that, because it is a problem if 2 people are parking on either side, you can't get through on a 26-foot street. So for the snow parking, I like the idea that you had of having either side of the street, but that could be, I know you're trying to be equitable, but that can be confusing, maybe just one side of the street or one area, I don't know. I'm trying to be fair, but at the same time, I make it less confusing. I don't like, though, the idea of saying prioritizing some streets, because I think what happens then is becomes a class thing. And some streets are always plowed and some aren't. So I don't particularly like that option. And then finally, I know this is about codes and not zoning, but one of the things we have talked about with state lands is whenever they make land available, it defaults to RR. And so addressing that, because I think that would help a lot if it doesn't default to RR, defaults to something that's higher density.
Megan?
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Lots of good information. I have more questions than comments, honestly. Could you explain under the menu of required sustainable design elements, Proposition 207? I know that you also mentioned it, Mary, and I need some clarification on what that is.
Okay, so Prop 207 is the Private Property Rights Act. Basically, the the sweet part of Prop 207 is if we change the zoning code, and it could be other codes, but primarily it focuses on zoning codes. If there is a perceived value change in your land, so the easiest way to do it is building height. So if we took you could have a 60-foot tall building and we decided we didn't want to do that anymore. We're now only going to allow 45 feet. There's a perceived loss in value there. And so what that law says is that if we change the code and we reduce the value of your property, we have to compensate you for that loss. Which of course makes it really hard, right? We're not money bags. We don't have the ability to compensate those individual owners. So what generally happens is a property owner may ask for a waiver from that standard, and the city can, instead of compensating them, we can offer them a waiver. So then what you end up with is sort of a patchwork quilt of a zoning map where one property is adhering to one set of standards developed or approved one day, and a different property owner's is accepted a different set of standards. That's Prop 207 in a nutshell. What a menu-based approach does is it makes it easier for a developer to pick and choose between options. And like I said, something, a sustainability feature might be easier or more cost effective for a multifamily housing developer to utilize than a single family homeowner. Because I think Mary pointed out, right? So with single family homes, you're looking at an end consumer. With multifamily, you have a developer who is a property owner who, depending upon how they split up the cost of those, the utilities or things like that, and they just have different approaches to overall maintenance and long-term component of that building. So a menu-based approach allows us to build in flexibility and make things more palatable to developers and allows them to come up with items that work. Again, we have to calibrate what is it, what are the right best features, and what's the right set of points. Yeah, hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that definitely helps. And then I have another question. I'm interested in the modeling that these consultants did and the comment that increasing market rate housing, it may lead to a decrease in overall cost. But how do they model that in the sense of population influx? And like, did they do it over like a 30-year period? Like, what's the time period? And did it ever decrease costs?
So they didn't model that component, that more housing equates to less housing. There is a general level of study out there, right? So I can pull up lots of articles where housing production has equated to housing price reduction, right? So part of what we are facing is that we know that we've fallen behind. So when the market fluctuates, we have times of good housing production and we have times where housing production sort of falls short. And so if you think back over the last 20 years, I have experienced times where, I mean, we were going hard at housing production and then times when the market just sort of collapsed and fell out, the bubble burst and we weren't producing housing. The one thing that I can tell you about Flagstaff and just the time that I've been here is we're slower to slow down, but we're also slower to pick up. And our reaction in that market, and so what we're feeling today is somewhat of a reaction to that. When we slowed down, we never got to pick back up, right? So we didn't have we didn't have developers working through the entitlement process. We didn't have pieces of land that were ready to go when the market picked back up. Um, there's a lot of assumptions that go into it, but the promise that housing production as a whole equates to affordable housing units is hard because of the competing factors in every market now. And those are short-term rentals, they are second homes. Those are always things that, because affordable housing too in Flagstaff has always, like, even though the nation is under a housing crisis, Flagstaff has always had this housing crisis because we have always been desirable for those things. We have always had competitive competition from outside sources. So it's really impossible to walk in and say housing production 100% is going to equate to the market changing what those prices of those homes are. A developer is going to go for that market price. And I have seen that market price dramatically change in the last 8 years.
No, I completely agree. And then in terms of where are the questions?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, the zoning districts, it just makes me think of the project that was passed for the rezone on Lake Mary Road. And I mean, I'm all for more housing. I think the hard thing about that project was the access to resources. And I know that they're going to extend the transit line to that project. Um, but I think in an ideal world, you would already develop where those resources are, right? So if I had to choose, I mean, places closer to downtown, but then also there's like these micro districts away from downtown that make sense too. I mean, that's tricky when you're targeting certain areas in terms of just who's living there, who's going to be affected. So, I mean, I agree already going into neighborhoods and understanding, how they perceive change. So,
I
yeah.
will tell you that the one thing as a planner that I find so hard is if you don't have the housing units there, you'll never get the transit there, right? It's a chicken and an egg. Transit is not going to go and serve areas that are undeveloped. They just won't. And so to say that we only want high density on a transit corridor would sell us short of where we could put density because transit will generally follow. Now, if they have money, because it costs money to extend. And so that's part of the conversation. But that is that whole chicken and the egg kind of thing. It's the same thing with grocery stores, right? A lot of times we'll come in with the development and people will be like, there's no grocery store here. But the grocery store won't show up until you have the population there to support it.
Yeah, this is like never ending questions
Yeah.
with this whole
It's
thing.
why we all get paid the big bucks, right?
Right. Um, so did they, now I'm kind of confused on what exactly they modeled. Did they model like the idea of having different city centers, or like what was the modeling?
So what they did is they looked at the zoning category. So they focused on R1. They did not focus on RR or ER specifically because the idea is that we still want to see those rezoned to higher density, even though they can develop with PRD. They looked at MR, they looked at HR and our commercial zones. So they looked at both market rents, and then they also looked at ownership as well. But based on the parking ratios and the number of units, they were seeing if the minimum feasible price moved, right? So if I just pick one scenario in here for scenario 2, as they look at it, it shows where the prices are move within each zoning category based on how the change happens, and return on investment. So if a developer can get X more unit, if you can now develop a project that's 80 units an acre as opposed to 29, your return on investment may be much higher. Of course, that's looking at multifamily and what those rents are for sale, right? It's a little bit harder. And so we want to fix everything all together, but market rate and rental and ownership and rental are really two different animals at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions or comments from commissioners? Mary?
Um, so I guess I wanted to summarize, and among all my comments, I would be leaning toward scenario 3. And I don't know if you're going to want more from us at this point in time. I guess you can, let us know. But I did want to ask, like, this is not something that was necessarily touched on in this, but has it been considered, or are there options or avenues to partner for infrastructure cost sharing when you do have smaller, developments that we want smaller product size in? Because I mean, what the argument is that smaller square footages just don't pencil out. So is there any relief that could be provided in some sort of a partnership situation with a developer to help them with their infrastructure costs instead to make that happen?
I'm smiling so big because I feel like you had my office bugged today. And so, as part of the scope of this project, infrastructure cost reduction strategies is actually part of the last part. So the land availability, sorry, it is late. The land availability site suitability site or study, and the because of what a big undertaking that was, we didn't get that deliverable. So we met with the consultant team today actually to talk about that. And so one of the things they kind of offered different solution, kind of a broad brush stroke of different strategies, strategies that could be kind of categorized, so that it's like if we were doing downtown development and infill development versus greenfield development, and then very project specific. And we chose that middle one, just kind of, I think what you're asking for. So yes, there is a possibility for, we're exploring what, I should say, we are exploring as part of this project what those cost reduction strategies could look like, specifically as it relates to infill development versus greenfield development. So I love that you just asked that because it feels like that just validates that we're on the right track. So thank you.
And I wonder, like, I know, like, we can't dictate product that they're going to build. They do their own thing.
Yeah.
And we can't dictate that they restrict short-term rentals, but are we allowed to incentivize smaller square footages? Are we allowed to incentivize that if they put restrictions in there of short-term rentals into their CCNRs, that there are some, something that we could offer them in return?
Yeah, thank you.
And my last comment was, that I would rather see shorter setbacks and smaller lot sizes instead of parking and resource reductions. And the one thing that, of course, doesn't come up in all this, but I sit as the liaison on the Open Spaces Commission. So it's always a topic of, we have all these needs and desires, and then there's still open space over in the corner going, what about me? So I just want to throw that out there that is something that the community values, and just want to give a plug to it.
Thank
I-
you.
I also agree with her, shorter setbacks and smaller lot sizes as opposed to the parking um, issue. I would agree with that.
Thank you.
100%. Any other comments or questions from commissioners? Oh, one more, Mary.
I did, as long as Jenny's getting up there. Is there any specific sustainability element that we're lacking that you're really wishing you saw more of, or that you want to see, you want to incentivize?
Yeah, good question. Well, our current incentives incentivize energy efficiency, all electric buildings, waste reduction and management, water resource reduction in water use, and EV charging, which are all important, but they're really far from getting us to our council's adopted goal of getting to carbon neutrality. So I think having those be stricter standards would be, or more effective standards, I think those would go a long way. There's lots of other things that we can look into that were looked into in this report, including, solar, passive solar design, solar PV panels, things like that. But that's a good question. And I think really making the current standards be more effective would be the biggest thing, but there are other things that can be added into those as well.
So more of a broad stroke of what's there, just trying to get some people to bite on it.
And I think too, looking into what are some other options that we could fit into that as well, because there were a bunch of categories in the report that are in addition to what we have now. So I think, but those are kind of the biggest things, and that's why they're in there. But I do think there's opportunities for some additional things as well. But I just wanted to make a comment. I know this is a lot to take in, and I appreciate everyone's comments and thinking this through. And one thing I would encourage you to consider as you're thinking through comments, as you kind of digest this report, is thinking about affordability, not just in terms of the initial cost to purchase a home or rent a home, but also ongoing cost to operate the home as well. I mean, Commissioner Norton, you've talked about smaller sizes. I mean, that's a huge part, right? Your energy bills are going to be lower. Your water bills will likely be lower if you don't have a lot of landscaping outside, for example. But I also just, thinking about some of these sustainability features as well, like they can increase long-term affordability of a home just by reducing monthly operating costs. So it's really a lot of different pieces to put together, but just encourage folks to consider that as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
And sorry, I'm going to also, two things. One, there is a member of the public that I believe that wants to provide comment, but on that note of Genevieve noting about how hard, like how much this is to digest, we completely understand that. And so the project doesn't end when we go to council. We're going to be getting feedback at council, and there's still a lot of outreach that we want to do. But I would ask that if you want to provide comments before we go to council, so we can kind of give whatever updates and kind of have your influence in that, that would be great. So we will be there February 4th. So if you could just send your comments individually to Alex and she can get it to us. And I think just please remember not to copy everybody so that we don't have an open meetings issue. But we really do want you to have the time to sit with this, kind of think about your questions, think about your comments, and get them back to us. And so by the 4th would be great. But if it's later than that, it doesn't mean that we won't be thinking about it and it won't have an impact. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from commissioners? Okay, we will go to comments and questions from general public. And I do have a speaker request from David Hayward. If you please come forward and state your name and address for the record. And you have 3 minutes. So if we can, somebody get the timer started.
Start talking before the timer and get extra time. My name is David Haywood. I live at 3325 North Antler Crossing, the great town of Flagstaff, Arizona. For those of you who don't know me, I am a real estate developer. I was, I'm going to say previously, because I think it's no longer extant, the chair of the Regional Planning Commission. I am now a member of the County Planning and Zoning Commission, and I'm a board member at Flagstaff Shelter Services. That said, obviously, I'm here talking on my own behalf and not any, not any of those roles. I'd like to, also kind of preface, my comments here with, 2 points. So, that I'm not just kind of a money grubbing developer who just wants to stuff my pockets, at the expense of everyone else. I mean, two things with my work at Flagstaff Shelter Services, we're putting in, I want to say it's 164 units of affordable housing for, the housing that's essentially going to be free for the, the very neediest members of our community. That's something I'm really proud of. I would also, I was loving listening to the list of sustainable building items because I do have all of those on my own home. We harvest rainwater. We have passive solar design, drive electric cars, and I'm proud to say as well we do produce more electricity than we use. So, that said, the two things I really wanted to raise, having seen these three scenarios is, one, we really have seen, I think, and I just want you to hear it clearly, that the incentive programs that we have in place currently really do not work. In the affordable housing projects that we have done, we simply chose not to take advantage of any of those incentives. In that case, that was largely due to the fact that those would have had to been approved by council. So we would have gone from a project that was approved at the staff level to a project that was then coming in front of council and getting it approved that way. That was not a risk we were willing to take. I think that's also important to note, right, that this isn't 100% true, but in general, you have affordable housing developers and you have market rate housing developers. And just as, it doesn't matter how much you offer to pay when you go into a Chinese restaurant, they're not going to make you Italian food. The same is true of a, market rate housing developer. The last point I wanted to make was, in regards to scenario 2, I'm hesitant, and I'm just because I don't.
Could we ask a question?
I mean, it's up to the chair if you want to even use the timer. I would
So
think since
I'm going to let him go one more minute. So if you can go one more minute and keep it concise.
Keep it concise. Go one last point. Tiffany did say she wants to get home for dinner. So the concern I have with scenario 2 just by itself is it feels like we're saying, look, we really need these density increases. We really need these parking reductions, these things that are going to get us more housing, but we're holding those hostage to sustainable requirements, right? I think we want both of those things, but I think if we tie them together, we're just going to set ourselves up for failure with both, right? And let's pursue all of those sustainable, building and site design issues as much as we can, but uncouple it from the density issues so that we can, you know, try to get our cake and eat it too, but I don't think that's the right way to go about it. So thanks. And if you do have any real questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you. Did you have a question, Mary? Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Are there any other questions or concerns from the public? We'd love to hear them. We would love to hear them. No? All right. This was, sorry.
Nope.
This took a lot of staff hours, and I want to commend you for your presentation and the staff hours that it took. We do appreciate it. And we will look at this further and email our comments to Alex. And move on to, I think we're to item 6, which is miscellaneous items to and from commissioners. Hearing,
I just
Okay.
wanted to say, I know at the last meeting I had asked about, if there was any results of why there might not have been a council liaison appointed to P and Z for us. I don't know if you got an answer on that, but I do see a new council member here present, so thank you for attending. But anyway, just thought I'd ask and follow up on that.
I have not received an answer to date. I have asked.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else to and from commissioners? Hearing nothing, there's no commissioners online. We are adjourned at 5:56 p.m. Thank you all.